Hi, I'm Bill Cavness. I'm the director of the Asbestos Institute, and I wanted to talk a little bit right now about a paragraph in the OSHA construction standard, paragraph F. It's called Exposure Assessments and Monitoring. It's about air monitoring data by which we can measure our compliance with the standard, meaning we don't have exposure to workers, especially we don't have exposure above the permissible exposure limit. And let me put this on the board to start with here, and we can refer to it, but probably the most important issue under the OSHA construction standard is this issue about how are we going to protect our employees from exposure to this carcinogen, and how do we measure compliance with that so that we'll know if our work procedures, our control measures work. Can we do this work with no exposure safely, or are we having exposure with our method? So we have this line here, this threshold called the permissible exposure limit, the PEL, and it's defined in the OSHA standard. Actually, there are two measurable limits here, one for a full day average and one for a short-term 30-minute average. Okay, so this is our PEL. For a full day of work, it's at 0.1 fibers per cc. And the EL, by the way, I'll put that here just so we don't lose track of it, is 1.0 fibers per cc. The EL, or excursion limit, is the short-term measurement. 0.1 is the long-term, 1 day of work. Okay, now if we go above this line in our measurement of asbestos in a worker's breathing zone that he breathes, then we have exposure. And as long as we stay below this line in our air monitoring results showing what a worker may be exposed to while he's doing work in a certain way, technically, under the regulation, we have no exposure. Okay. No exposure doesn't mean that there's no asbestos in the air. It just means we're below the exposure line, okay? And that's where we're required to be. So when we do air monitoring, actually measuring the contamination in the air right here in a worker's breathing zone, that's what we're measuring for, is to make sure that we're doing the work in a way that protects the worker and that we're in compliance with this regulation. Okay, now the most important thing I said was this. The most important compliance issue is we've got to have air monitoring data. We cannot do asbestos work in the construction industry, and that means maintenance as small as drilling a hole in the wall. We can't do work without some kind of air monitoring data. We've got to have the data. If we don't have the data, then we must assume positive for exposure. And maybe that doesn't mean anything if nobody knows anything about it except me, whether I assume positive or not. But OSHA, as a compliance and enforcement agency, assumes positive for exposure up here with no data. We've got to have the data. Now there's two forms of data. One is current data that I get every day because I have air monitoring pumps hanging on my asbestos workers every single day. That's what an asbestos abatement contractor typically does. The other form of data is previously generated data that's based on doing a certain work with certain controls to a certain material. And we'll go beyond that with some detail. We use trained workers and all that. But what that previous data tells us is, with that situation, using those controls, we don't have any exposure, and it's been proven by statistical analysis, evaluation of the air monitoring that was done when that work was done, okay? So one other comment generally about OSHA and why they regulate the way they do. See, OSHA in our construction industry is there to protect the 5.5 million workers that work in this industry. But they need to do it in a sensible, thoughtful way because they're a compliance and enforcement agency. They give us regulations that tell us what we have to do when we work with hazardous materials to protect workers or employees. Now, there is a range of controls that OSHA has to look at, and they'll range everywhere from ultimate controls to no controls. So the most ultimate you can think of would be over here. No controls at all would be over here. And the ultimate controls can't work for OSHA because nobody would follow them. Nobody could afford to follow them. And so they just wouldn't. Work has to get done in the construction industry, and it would just get done. People would be exposed. And no controls, of course, would be exposure also. So someplace in the middle, OSHA has to figure out a way that an employer can and will try to comply with the standard to protect his employees and can afford to do it. And the country can go on and operate. Okay? So it's not going to be ultimate control. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. Now, with that in mind, then, OSHA came up with this concept written into regulations since 1994 that's called negative exposure assessment. Now, the first step in understanding this is that the employer has to have a competent person, that's somebody knowledgeable and trained in charge of his, in this case, asbestos work. And that person does an assessment of asbestos work to be done. Now, this assessment is required by law. It's called an initial exposure assessment. And it's just a competent person looking at asbestos work to be done in a certain way using certain controls by trained workers, and he makes the statement based on his experience and prior data, actually, that if we do it this way, there will not be any exposure, meaning exposure above the PEL. We'll always be down here where we need to be, based on his experience and prior data. Okay, that's the concept of an initial exposure assessment. It got to be done. You can't not do it. So if an employer knows he's working with asbestos, he has to have this exposure assessment. Now, it's OSHA's intent, of course, that this is where we do the work, not above the line. So the assessment is like a thoughtful consideration of how I'm going to remove this ceiling tile with no exposure. I think most of us in the industry could sit down and figure that out and write it on a piece of paper. Okay, now I have a protocol written out here on the piece of paper. This is the way we're going to do this work, and there's not going to be any exposure. That's making the statement negative exposure assessment. We want the assessment in a way that it is negative. So then we go ahead and do the work by this protocol with air monitoring in place, personnel monitoring on the workers. Okay, with the personnel monitoring in place, we get the data back, the analytical data that says there's no exposure. In fact, we're not only below this level, we're down here into the decimal point with several zeros perhaps, a very clean level because of the way we do the work. That's called a negative exposure assessment. A valid NEA is just the initial exposure assessment, how we're going to do the work, coupled with air monitoring, proving that there's no exposure when we do it that way. Okay, now when the next ceiling tile job comes up, then I can apply that protocol to the next job and use my prior air monitoring data and be exempt from being required to do air monitoring on the current job. And in fact, if I were a ceiling tile contractor and that's what I did for a living, I could use that prior data over and over and over. It would simplify my work, make it a whole lot less expensive. I wouldn't have to pay a consultant, pay a lab, buy air monitoring pumps and all that, because I know I have protection to the workers because of my control methods, and it's proven to have no exposure. Okay, that's the negative exposure assessment. Now, we've got to have one or the other, the current air monitoring data on this job or the assessment, or we're in non-compliance with OSHA and we have to assume that our workers are exposed. One quick word about the various levels of that prior data that OSHA gives us. In that paragraph F in the construction standard for asbestos, first of all, it says we have to do air monitoring where it's required, and these things are referenced. So we do air monitoring. Then it gets into the assessment. You have to have the assessment. Then it gets into the assessment data, meaning the air monitoring data, that we back up that assessment with. And there are really three levels of data, I suppose, for a negative exposure assessment. The first, I would say, is called objective data. In fact, in three sub-paragraphs with capital letters A, B, and C, that would be A. Objective data means air monitoring data from an outside source. I didn't generate it, me as a contractor. It came from a manufacturer of a product that I'm working with, or perhaps an inventor or manufacturer of a control method that I'm using. Or it could come from an agency like OSHA itself, who has given us that data several times in the history of this standard, on roofing, on floor tile removal. So objective data is just saying we've done the air monitoring by following this procedure, and there is very little, if any, chance of exceeding the PEL, and we've got the data to prove that. So use this method, you won't exceed the PEL. Okay, but it's data from an outside source, and there's very little of that in the industry. The second level of NEA data, or air monitoring data, would be historical data. That would be the paragraph B in that list of the three paragraphs. And that's data that's generated in-house. That's really what employers do whenever they do air monitoring data. The only problem is, if it is a problem, that the data is only good for 12 months of the certain work that's going on. Now, it is data that proves there is no exposure by following a certain control, and we can use that, but it's only good for 12 months, and we have to renew it with current air monitoring, which is fine because people and procedures change and all that. But it's the idea of minimizing our costs, still protecting our workers, okay? Objective data and historical data, what we generate in-house. If we don't have any prior data, see, and both of those are prior sources of data, then we have to be doing air monitoring right now whenever we do the work. The pump on the belt, the cassette up here on the clothing to measure the air contamination in the worker's breathing zone. And that's kind of what abatement contractors do, or people that don't have prior data have to do. But we have to have the data. If we don't, we have to assume positive. Now, if we have the data at the historical level, well, at any of the levels actually, if we have the data, it gives us exemptions from burdensome OSHA requirements. Now, you may want to use the requirements anyway. They're worker protection issues, but you're not required to. It takes the regulatory burden off. Respirators, protective clothing, ongoing air monitoring, any level of decontamination. I mean, there is no exposure. So these things are not required. Okay, so you get a lot of advantage in having the data documented, and with no exposure, then those expensive or time-consuming controls are not required. Like I said, you could use them if you want to, but it takes the regulatory burden off. Okay, well, understand that thing about data. You've got to have data either currently generated or in place previous data that shows what you're doing is here and not here. Thank you.